Okay, so we're going to be doing this panel on planning in the data-centric age, and the panelists are here. Their names are there. Alan, Shirin, Ryan, Shlomo, and I am Subbarao Kambhampati. I'm the moderator. You can imagine how good I am at moderation. The premise for this panel is that automated planning has mainly been model-based. Recent progress in other areas has been data-centric. Do we need to change in any way? Okay, so that's basically the premise. So a bunch of people ask, is this festivus? Really, no, we have nothing to complain about. We have reached a certain level of nirvana right now, so we are all happy. So it's not festivus at all, okay? What it is basically, let me give you a small background on this. So that's our community, planning community, happy people. And there was, I think if you registered, you got one of these I love buttons, and it said I love robots. Give me a break. We don't love robots. We love our models, okay? We love PDDL 2.3.5.7, PDDL, RDDL, MPDDL, and even before the fiddle stuff, there used to be other models like KRSL, etc. This is the stuff that we really love, right? And we having our good lives, but there have been pressures on us. That's the sad part, right? And some pressure that we are pretty much aware of. People have been basically squeezing us. One of the kinds of pressures that we have always been aware of is this: people, bozos from NASA, military, even power industry, etc., saying your models are not expressive enough. It doesn't have nonlinear equations. It doesn't have processes. It doesn't have this. It doesn't have that. How are we going to use your models? And they've been yelling at us. And we once in a while pay some attention to them and then think about how planning community can deal with this sort of a criticism. This has been there. And what I want to bring up is there's been a new set of people who've been trying to yell at us. Well, maybe yell at us or not, at least you can feel the pressure, which is that, as I said, the rest of the world, in various areas has become highly data-centric. So there used to be an area called vision, and it just is basically visual data plus deep learning. There is no vision actually as a theory left anymore. They have all this ImageNet, CocoNet data, and then NLP has its own Ngram corpus, and the Bronx corpus, and so on and so forth. So these guys, if you tend to talk to them about planning, they basically say, wow, how great. You guys have models? How do you get these models? Who exactly is giving you these models? And if you are a real serious discipline, where is your data sets? Here exactly the huge data sets being kept and so on. So that's sort of a cartoonish view of the premise as to whether we should be caring about it. This stuff is important, but we have talked about this. This stuff, I don't know that we have talked about it. We talk about it, we don't necessarily have to change our research. We might, for example, I'm told that in the PlanRock panel, people have decided that really the other communities have to wise up and realize how important PDDL is, and then that will be all great. But similarly, we could decide here too. But I thought that's a good thing to start with. So I got this. We talked about whether or not to have this panel, and we had all these people agree that it's a worthwhile thing to talk about. And so here we are. And there's a partial list of issues that I suggested to the panel. Those include, for example, if planning were to be data-centric, I'm not saying that planning should only be data-centric, but if it also were to be data-centric, should we be busy curating plan data sets and our own ImageNet, maybe we have a PlanNet, okay? And I know that in Europe there used to be a PlanNet, it can now become a PlanNet. Okay, and then are our communities modeling languages, if we did go towards this data-centric side, are our communities modeling languages, PDDL, etc., going to be equally useful when they need to be acquired from the data as against being hand-given? And this is a reasonable question to ask. At least, some of us, for example, in my own work, in my own group's work, we have looked at the fact that you could learn a spectrum of models, and sometimes learning the shallower end models and using them winds up being more effective in some cases. So that might be a question you might want to think about. The third question is, should our validation metrics also change and relax? For example, one of the great games that natural language processing community has played is, instead of talking about meaning of a sentence, they talk about perplexity of the generated text with respect to the old text. and you feel this monotonic progress just washing all over you, except when you see one of those actual, sentences, you might cringe. So the interesting point is, if we do data-centric planning at all, we still tend to evaluate it in terms of is the validator set for the PPDDL or PDDL saying that this plan is correct. We might very well want to consider other types of metrics such as perplexity metric, maybe while thinking about it. To what extent is reinforcement learning just the answer? So in fact, that's the thing that we also have people from reinforcement learning in the community. So is that just enough? How do we handle the data versus doctrine tension? I mean, we still do have a large number of areas where, it's like they would like you to take the doctrine that they have and convert it into the models, but there also is data available. So how do we actually combine those two different tensions? And then what, if any, do you see as an albatross in the current ICAPS dogma, which is data-centric planning? So is there things that we should be relaxing? And then also, are we already doing data-centric planning anyway? And those of you who are not sitting in this room but were sitting in the other room might have seen during the day that in fact there are all sorts of interesting work that's being done on smart grids and on taxis, etc., where parts of the models are acquired anyway from the data. And then, of course, finally, the most important question, what do we do with the GPUs, really? I mean, that's seriously, if you are an AI community right now, we should find a use for GPUs, right? So that's what I suggested as things to think about. And then, of course, given that nobody takes any instructions, I'm sure all of our esteemed colleagues here would actually come up with very different take on this. I did tell them that each of them get exactly 5 minutes. I don't know how much I took, but they literally get exactly 5 minutes. And then that way we'll have close to 30 minutes of discussion from you guys. And then of course the rest of the conference we can be talking about this at the conference. So that's where we are going to stop. I just mentioned that it's the 5-minute initial statements are going to be done in the order of the funniest person first, most alphabetical order. Alan Conan is going to go, and then Scott, then Shirin, then Ryan, then Shlomo. Followed by, of course, the question and decisions. Alan?
There are enough jokes in my talk.
There they are. They should be okay.
What?
Are we recording this?
I believe so.
This.
Yeah. No, they just said use this, that's why I said.
I'll use this. All right, so we'll see. I had some animations there. So let's go ahead. All right. Well, you're not going to get the animations. Yeah, I think I'll talk about something related to what Rao wants me to talk about. I mean, when I started thinking about this, there's just so many things to talk about. I'll try to focus on one. And so there's a common mantra that you hear all the time now, data to decisions. And for me, that people actually do think about planning or optimization and decision making when they hear decisions in that context. They're not thinking just classify whether an image has a bird in it. So I think that right there, the funders and most everybody intuitively planning and decision making is part of that. And today, as Ralph said, you go upstairs and I was actually very impressed. We have a really good community of people working on interesting problems, like fairly realistic, creative problems. So it seems like, if we can keep building that community, we're in really good shape. But the questions I wanted to look at, the first one is, do we need explicit models? That's sort of, does ICAPS need to exist? That's sort of an existential question. And then if we do, what can ICAPS, what can we offer? And I really didn't go into too much depth there. You guys can figure that out. So do we need models? So the standard thing that we saw today upstairs was you have some data, you learn a model, you may be learning how often do people turn left at a light at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you have an automated planner. Right? That's our standard thing. We work on the planner side mostly. Well, what's the alternative to that? If we don't want models, well, it's model-free reinforcement learning, right? And this is where we might feel insecure, right? If you, in AI today, when people talk about planning and decision-making, a lot of people just go straight to deep RL. And if you listen to DeepMind and a lot of people in that community, it's all reinforcement learning. Learn from scratch. Don't be giving models or advice or anything. So I wanted to try to unpack that and see if it's a reasonable point of view. So, learning from scratch, why, if we think about model-free reinforcement learning, learning from scratch in the real world is generally not going to be something you can do, right? You're not going to be experimenting with traffic light signals in the real world. Any real problem with serious consequences, you're going to be using RL offline to learn a policy of some sort. So if you're willing to do that, and you have to do that, well, that requires a learned model or simulator for this offline learning. And so, just based on that, model-free RL is really we should just view it as another type of planner in that scenario. And it's just a planner that happens to learn a complete policy usually and throws away the model for the online execution. It just reactively executes it. So I just want to unpack that a little bit. This might be where we are. We do deliberative planning in an online scenario. So I'm thinking online scenarios here. What a model-free RL would do is give you a fast reactive policy, a circuit that just zips through and gives you an action. And it's worth looking at the differences here. There's obvious differences. Speed versus quality. So obviously the fast reactive policy is going to be blazingly fast, and we saw in Sylvie's talk today, speed is a problem in these really hard domains where you need to make decisions quickly. Quality, though, a lot of times it feels like it's going to be hard to compile away all this search into a circuit like that. AlphaGo is a good example of this. While a lot of people might think it's just based on RL, search was essential. They did an amazing, that network that was blazingly fast was actually an amazing Go player, but it was not world class. They needed search wrapped around it. Finally, I'd say when it comes to trustworthiness, it feels like we want some sort of model at least, even if it's not fully accurate, to at least give us some certificate of reasonableness of the action. If you just have this circuit making actions and making decisions, it feels harder to trust to me. If there's some sort of certificate, I'll trust it more. And so the way I like to look at this is there's really a big space in between here. And it's fine to be learning some sort of reactive knowledge, some sort of intuition to guide our search. And so I'm interested in this space here where I think this is where the reinforcement learning in our community could really come together. Figure out how to combine the best of both worlds. So finally, what can the ICAPS community offer? A couple of things. There's a lot of things I could have kept going. But RL and planners require heuristic guidance for the hard problems, right? We can just apply RL and just plain UCT with no heuristics to relatively easy problems, but that only goes so far. So ICAPS has great ideas for heuristics in specific languages, but and also ideas for how to view those heuristics in different ways. So Sylvie's talk this morning was interesting. You can view the delete relaxation in a certain way, and she was able to derive the heuristic that way in a different problem. So I think we should try to apply our minds and the principles that we've developed to heuristics for a wider class of models. What if we started with a neural net model? You want to make a splash? Start with a neural net model and figure out how to design good heuristics. So that will be all over our guide and all over Twitter. So, all this stuff there.
Next is up.
You're on slide, I'm just going to read.
Okay.
Okay, so I think Alan and I are largely in sync. I don't want to add too much, so I'll be quick here. For me, I kind of agree, being entirely model free online, you don't want your traffic controller, your HVAC system to be, cooling or heating the room, just to learn about things. We have lots of offline data, many domains. We have 2, 3, 10 years of data. We can learn great models from that data, and so let's see what we can learn in those models offline. I think you're much more efficient if you actually exploit a model and just sort of sample blindly. I'm not a fan of the AlphaGo work where you sort of, have to have 1,000 or 2,000 machines just to search in a tree. So I do like models, and I see just 2 basic camps for how to use model data. Either you just need to learn the parameters, and then we're back to riddle, PDL, whatever. That's easy. We can do our work. Or in some cases, you might want to learn the structure of parts of your models, right? There are parts you know well, laws of physics, Ohm's law, etc. I would hate to learn these things from data. But there are other things like an HVAC, the thermal conductance of walls and so on, or what parts of the building affect each other that I might want to learn from the data. But that's not hard. I've got current state and action, next state. We have tons of methods to learn those models. In that case, though, we do end up with the issue of how do you plan and learn the model, because those learned models may not look like the models we manually specify. I think that's a great challenge. I have a paper with a student at ICAPS, about how to do that, but there are many other ideas of how to plan and learn models. But I think that's where I would like to see ICAPS go, right? So your models still have states, they still have effects, but they're not as clean as the ones we're used to manually specifying. How does that change our planners? It's a great question. I'd like to see more of that. Just to answer some of Raul's other questions, I really don't see any tension with ICAPS. I see great opportunity for us. Should planning be data-centric? I certainly think we should run a probabilistic planning competition or even deterministic planning competition where we do just give the data, right? We generate data from our models, but we just give the data to the competitors, right? They can learn the model and plan it. Wouldn't that be quite interesting? Okay. And finally, to answer Raul's final questions, are the community's modeling languages useful when they're acquired from data? Absolutely, you can learn effects, and I've already seen plenty of papers on that. With Riddle, I'm already learning parts of the Riddle model from data, even deep nets. Right? And deep nets are not black boxes, they're gray boxes. They actually have a lot of structure, especially if you structure them. So I think our languages directly support parts that can be learned from data, so that's not a problem at all. Finally, how do we use GPUs? I think we can use them quite well. You'd be amazed at what you can do with TensorFlow and the latest gradient descent algorithms running on GPUs. So like my group right now is working on how you use TensorFlow as a planning system. It does auto-dip, it can do amazing gradient descent in non-convex spaces and find solutions that you just couldn't find before. So I think we have opportunities to use the GPUs as well.
Hi, my name is Shireen Sohrabi. Just a few sentences about me. I work at IBM Research in New York. It's about 5 years of working there. There's a lot of applications of planning that planning can be used for, but there are also lots of barriers of using planning. And what I do in my everyday life is to make sure that people still use planning and help in use of planning in different applications. So I want to talk about 3 points, and I may not cover all of these points. So 3 points. One is that something that has never happened before, it would be very hard to predict. And so that means that partially there's no data, or the data is not in the form that we want it to be. And that's especially the application that I'm currently working on. So we had a paper at the Spark. This is a risk management project where we are working with chief financial officers in order to understand their domain, the economical states, and all the things that influence their model. And they were really wanted to help us come up with a domain, but they specifically told us we're not writing PDDL. So we had to find ways, and this is knowledge engineering work, and there's knowledge engineering workshop, and this is one of the, I guess, great things that's going on at ICAPS, which really helps in not just helping with the user in terms of writing the domain, but also visualizing the end results and sort of interaction with the human, which is very, very important. So that's number one. So I guess just to say also that there's been lots of work on learning, but sometimes even the ones that I guess Scott was saying is that you do have the traces, and these traces are coming from the complete domain, which in some real applications is not possible when you're trying to do the job. You don't have the traces to begin with, so that's very hard to get. So my second point is that while learning the domain from scratch is actually could be quite hard. I agree with some of the other earlier points that you can learn some part of it. And there's papers here learning axioms, maybe learning the duration of actions, learning costs, learning some causal relationships, not necessarily in PDDL, but will help you understand more about the domain. And the problem that arises, the problem that I see that arises from learning this external knowledge is that you may already have some domain to begin with, and then you're learning some extra things that they may not match. So you have a problem of inconsistencies between things that you're learning if you're augmenting your domain. And a solution to that would be model-like planning, of course, and also getting a list of possible plans or generating a set of plans rather than one. And then getting the help of the user in giving you a thumbs up and thumbs down, or some sort of a feedback on which of these plans you actually liked. And then you have the feedback loop, and you learn the domain that way. So it's sort of augmented domain learning, which is quite good. And my third point is that there was an earlier panel on Spark, which Daniel Magazine mentioned that we are competing with AI not equal to learning, and especially not just learning is deep learning. And in order to address some of that issues, we need to find ways to make AI planning more amenable to a greater audience. So having some sort of a domain repository of all the domains that are realistic and people have worked on will greatly help on that regard. And it starts from us and believing that planning is useful, believing that we can use planning on many applications. And there are barriers of just taking learning approaches, and we still need the models to deal with things. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so I figured out by this time that my esteemed colleagues had answered all of Rob's questions, and that since Scott is extremely systematic, that he went through the whole list. Right? Now, I also have to mention that Jonathan Swift said that I didn't have time for a short letter, so I will expect Rao to cut me off. But until I get there, right? So, yeah, I love data. Right? In this current era, I love data too. Okay, so we can't live without it, we know that, right? We can plan to collect data, and we can collect data to plan, right? We turn it into models or what, we don't bother with this reason about the data, right? Anyways, but we'll do it, right? Okay, so the question and the thing that I want to try to address is why do we do these things, right? And what are some of the things that we can do with data? I did not cover what my esteemed colleagues will do, right? So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples until Rob pulls me off. So the first is I'll pick something very close to home, which is goal-directed monitoring. By the time that I'll talk about planning to gather information or information-based planning, right? And then if I still have to pull off, then I'll do the notion of safety-driven probing perception. Of course, we need to learn models for this, so we don't use models, right? So I'd assume that everybody else has covered that topic by now. So if we just go into goal-directed monitoring, then we have a lot of plans, right, that we have developed. We probably have developed at least a million or more plans by now, right? We probably executed 10 of them, or maybe 15 right? So we decided that we should execute one of those plans. So I turned off the sound here, right? But this, you see if I turn it down to a more interesting place. I will get to a more interesting place, and I'll talk about it. So if we actually wanted to execute one of the first plans, right, which was just a block stacking example, when you talk about what to do, and you're actually collecting real data, then it's a very non-trivial task, right? So there's actually 5 really crappy, cheap webcams over here, which are trying to estimate the state of identifying objects. This is what the robot is thinking is going on. And then there's this human who just keeps mucking things up by moving blocks around the way, and they're trying to adapt, right? So all of that and the ability of the robot to be able to kind of infer its state and kind of adapt to the human is this area, which we call causal link monitoring. Now, if we actually do causal link monitoring on this kind of problem, in a real world, then we have to deal with the fact that we have observational uncertainty, so we have noisy sensors, right? We have hidden state, we have continuous variables. And so in that case, we have to deal with a dynamical system whose modes change, right? Deal with the noise of that. In this example, they had to deal with the fact that the cameras are faulty and they're giving you fake information, so you have to diagnose the cameras along the way. So if you look at the original problem that we took is causal link monitoring, right, which is a very beautiful idea, but not explored that much in the community since initial ideas, then there's really a very rich data processing problem. So how do we actually do goal monitoring and how do we monitor that robustly? And that immediately becomes a fundamental problem if you do the execution of things. And then, of course, you have to be able to learn the models to be able to support that. And then if we start talking about, we're going to an AMOS world, right, where we're actually working in a world where we have an uncontrolled environment, and those may be other drivers or maybe collaborators, right? And not only do we have to estimate their state, but we have to be able to predict what their actions are so we can act safely in the world. So I was just going to advocate that just within our home, if we actually want our plans to be useful, then we're really going to have to read a lot more about the data. We're going to need to look at the monitoring problem. That's a very rich area of research. Okay, so that's one example I just got, which is a problem that we should be doing. Right? Another example is the fact that if you want to be able to have autonomous systems act in the real world, then they do need to be able to plan, but they also need to be able to ensure that people are safe. So then the question is, how do we achieve that safety? Right? And so this is just an example of a mission that we operated 2 years ago, right, where we're dealing with safety. Now, if you think about these kinds of these missions, then we're often using air vehicles and underwater vehicles to gather information. So in those cases, they are doing planning and service of information gathering. And that's the notion of information-based planning. Right? So information-based planning is fundamental to a world where data is sparse and you need to work towards it. And you need to be able to develop planners. But certainly as trajectory optimization, you need to do planners and there's a range of planning. And it does involve motion, right, in this case. But for example, the issue of being able to get back and collect the data and be safe when you get back is really important. So not only do we need to have a system to plan to gather information, but we also need to make sure that it keeps itself safe along the way. And this is kind of one example, but you see it more generally. So we develop explorers, right, who work to acquire a science model, right? And that's the notion of information-based planning. High-value information is also in very risky environments. So we have to be able to think in our plans what's too risky. But the other thing is that if we have uncertainty in our model of the world, then what we can do is we can be able to do forward exploration to try to reduce the uncertainty of the world so that it becomes more safe to get our hard-value targets. So in that case, the process of interweaving information gathering right for our model so we can have a more predictable model versus acting to gather information is a real interesting interplay, a very interesting problem to explore. And we can have that in our real world as well. So if we're talking about a robot hardware and our robot hardware is failing, then what we can do is as we're controlling the robot, we can try to expose information which reveals failures. And we have that in everyday life, right? You know, we may go up and we have a door, we don't know if it's locked or not, so we go to the door now and we tug it a little bit. And then that disambiguates whether the door is locked or not, and then we act accordingly. So we're constantly acting in the world to gather information, right, which helps us to act. So that's just another area which is right within planning. Did you pull me out here? No, not quite. But you were just about to. Right, okay. So then the last one is the notion of safety-driven probing and perception. And what I think is interesting here is that if we talk about, for example, vision systems or perceptual systems, right, then, for example, there's a huge attention to autonomous vehicles, And a big part of the work in autonomous systems right now is the perception and how do we perceive the driver, how do we perceive pedestrians, the cars around you. And it's overwhelming about how do you collect that data. But there is a set of goals, right? The goals are to try to make sure that the passenger and the pedestrians and the people on the street are safe. So if you know that that's what your goals are, and that's what your plan is, then your perception system can be able to say, am I safe or not? Right? If you know that things are safe, right, then you can have your perception work elsewhere, right? If you're not sure, then you want to be able to guide your perceptual system to those things which will be able to help you assess risk. So in this case, the notion of risk becomes a driver for trying to decide how much information that you gather. More generally, if you have a set of goals, then you can guide the perceptual system in support of those goals. So in that case, perception and those deep networks are very much in service of planning.
Okay, so at the risk of referring to some of the things that were discussed, let me quickly say a couple of my thoughts about these topics. Well, first, I always thought about planning as really the hallmark of intelligence, but in a broader sense than sometimes than we think about, in the sense that we want to build agents that can choose actions, but how they choose actions, there's actually quite a lot of different ways, and we need to remember that. And all of them are valid, and many of them are represented by the community, but if we think about all these different mechanisms, an agent can choose actions by design because it was being hardwired or pre-programmed. Or it can use explicit deliberation. That's what we mostly are interested in, where you give the agent a model of the environment, and then it finds the best action or inaction by creating a plan. Or it can learn or adapt to have the right agent along the lines of reinforcement learning or other mechanisms. Or it can ask for help, and so on and so forth. And once you start thinking about real systems in the real world, they are not identified with any one mechanism, purely. There's always a great deal of design that goes into the solution, even if it's not explicit or thought about. Even systems that are considered in reinforcement learning model-free, they start with a set of actions. You decide what the actions are, what the states are, what the observations are, and so on. It's not completely self-selected. So that's one point. The other point is, well, models are very, very useful. They can provide lots of different information. That many of that was discussed. Maybe I will just add some advice from statisticians. We must not forget that the aim is to understand something about the real world, or predict, choose an action, make a decision, summarize evidence, and so on, but always about the real world. Our models are not the reality. So that's maybe one thing that I wanted to kind of underscore. So the other thing to remember is that there are no perfect models, regardless of how you generate them. Handcrafted or not, there are many reasons why the models are not perfect with respect to the reality that you're trying to model. And again, there are many reasons for that. There's also no perfect modeling languages. So statisticians are also being warned not to fall in love with their models, and I think the ICAPS community needs to be warned not to fall in love with its modeling language or languages, and kind of think about how to broaden them. So I think the algorithms we developed for the models that we have been focusing on are extremely useful, but as we saw in Sylvie's talk and in other examples, they may be used in an unusual way to solve a slice of the overall problem in the end. So to the question whether in the age of big data there is no need for models, I think that a lot of that was answered. But I want to just underscore one thing. There is no such thing as model free. I mean, the only techniques that are purely model free are generating tests, reasoning by enumeration, table lookup, and so on. Those cannot really work well for anything that is complex. So even if you think about machine learning techniques, including reinforcement learning, model-free reinforcement learning, there is actually a great deal of modeling that's going on. And the planning community also needs to see how it can leverage both data and models. So I will skip the summary, which is just reiterating that. And maybe just say, need to focus more on the real world and acknowledge that the models themselves are not the real world, the real world.
Okay, so we actually did, whoever said that we can't be on that. So what we're going to do actually is open the floor for questions. But I thought I'll take my prerogative to start one question at least, but one of the things is, some of you said, for example, that there are millions of plans that we already generated in my lab. You of course said it with tongue in cheek that we don't execute any of them. But I was wondering whether any of you think that we should really be out there setting up plan data sets that other people can use, because that seems to have had a huge impact in like ImageNet. I understand that ImageNet now makes people think that world is full of gods, but at least they have an actual data set, and that becomes the one that people use. We tended to have models as benchmarks, but we don't have any data sets. So I was wondering if any of you think that somebody here should be busy being the faculty of the planning community, where they set up a planet, and of course if you do that, where do you get these traces? Where exactly are we finding these traces? That's one of the CPS things I find in this. So are there any comments? And while they are trying to answer, if anybody wants to ask a question, please raise your hand, I will get you the mic. Yes, and there is an extra mic there.
That's an interesting question. I would think if I read most of the million plans that we've generated for the IPC and stuff like that, it would be that diversity useful, right? I mean, the planning domain, since Christian uses standing or sitting there. Right, so what I do think is good service is the fact that planning domains has provided a set of planners as a service. So people can go in and say, okay, I want to be able to generate a plan for this problem, they can model it and generate those plans. Whether or not the plans that we generate are actually inherently useful.
Yeah, we're going to do like a circular thing there, that we made the models and we're using those models to make the raw data. I'm talking more about getting plant traces from the wild. That's the same sort of thing that ImageNet guys did, and whether there's a way we could do it and whether we should be doing it. But if there's anybody else.
I was just trying to think of what maybe the RL community has done. And they're really, there is this thing called batch reinforcement learning, where you have a batch of data, for example, from hospital experiences. And sometimes these don't even need to be full traces. It can just be independent state action, state transitions. And so from that batch of data, they'll try to learn a policy. That seems a little bit limiting, but sometimes that's all we have is a batch of data. So, I mean, any of the applications I saw today would have been interesting. I guess it's a question of how many people would have the machinery to actually pull off the planning side for each of those applications, compared to a lot of the learning was relatively simple in some of those applications. But it would be interesting, because then you could ask questions such as, what if I try learning a deep net for this model, and then people could play with that as opposed to learning a few parameters. So, yes, it would be great.
I guess in my experience, it's been the case that we don't have the plant traces because we really don't have the domain to begin with. And you mentioned that sometimes in these papers learning, they do assume that somebody has this complete domain, and maybe they remove something, but maybe they still try to figure out that from the plant traces, what can you learn? And another point is that these plant traces are often correct or perfect in some way. So there's no inconsistencies, there's nothing wrong with them. They're coming from actual plants, so they are to be worked with. But in reality, first of all, it may be hard to get them, and second of all, they're not perfect. Something that could be done is some work from natural language. So data in terms of books, Wikipedia, social media, blogs. It could be that you can learn, and we did some work on that. So can you learn some causal relationship between terms, count, frequency, the words, etc. So there's maybe some work on that, but there needs to be more.
Okay, so let's get.
Right. So
stand up.
So I want to call attention to something that was in Brian's comments, and I think it's important here. So Brian made a distinction between engineering models and science models, right? So if I build a robot, I have a model of the robot. I built it, right? I know what it looks like. It's not a PDDL model, but it is a model I can reason with and do things with. So I might not have a model of the external environment, and that's where data can come in. But for our agents, we usually have fairly good models. So I wonder what you think about that.
It's only true to a degree, because if you think about it, you can say, when I activate the controller for a certain amount of time, the robot would move forward 1 meter. But that's not true. It depends on the surface that it's on. And until you place it in the real world, you don't know how much it will move. So there's a certain degree of need to build a model of the system. It's not necessarily. The other thing is that you can say, okay, physics is the model, but it's too fine. So you need to have, even you use an abstraction of the model of your own system, and it kind of summarizes what it can do at a high level.
Yeah, so let me just, and so I actually didn't, so that wasn't like a good point, which is, so if you're operating a robot, right, then your model of the robot or its environment may actually be very uncertain and make it very risky to the system. And it may get in the way of you achieving your goals, right, or gap the goals, information goals, including that, right? So the example that I gave is you have an underwater glider, which is very under-actuated, right? And you don't know the turbulent flows, right, in the reef, because it's very particular to that reef, right? And you don't know exactly what the reef is. So in those cases, really what you want to be able to do is acquire a model, right, of the currents well enough and the reef well enough that you can move in. So you really want to do those balances. Now that's not a PDL model, but you can kind of do the analogies for that as well.
Anybody else on that? So before we go off with the question, so one thing that we kept talking about is we considered whether there should be models at all, which is different from should they be closer to the kind of models we use. And I think there's a lot of you who said even model-free learning uses some kind of models. The real question is whether any of those models are close at all to any of the models that we wind up using in ICAPS community, and that would be a useful point to somebody. Yes. And anybody else who wants to ask questions, raise your hands. I'll get it.
I'm going to ask my question.
Okay.
Okay, so I was trying to get to the sort of bottom of the premise, the motivation for the premise you had. So are we asking and trying to figure out if we are, so are we sort of arguing the fact that people seem to perceive that AI has today become machine learning? AI has become deep learning, and the fact that planning does not seem to be considered? Or are we saying that they are doing something with data that we should also be doing? Right? If it's a perception issue, then we deal with it differently. We make tools available and things available for people so that people can learn to or end up using more of the planners and stuff like that. But if it is just or if there is actually a problem that we're not using data, which I don't think is the case, just by looking at the talks that we have here, then what are we actually discussing?
So, any of you want to answer?
Your question, Joe.
From behind the scenes. No, I will answer what the
Well, it's part of the mix. It's part of the mix of the topics that we're talking about. It's not focused on that. But there is an issue of The point that I made is, if the model becomes the reality, you don't need data. So there is that risk. There is certainly a lot of people in our community who are already using data. If you use entities, communities, and so on, you use data. Even if you don't use pure reinforcement learning and you use planning, you need to build a model and so on. So the question is, how can we leverage data even more, and even in deterministic learning?
Yeah, so the view that I would have is a lot of research communities, let's say, are driven by technical innovations, right? So the stick lasers, how people said, is the kind of single thing which allowed the dark challenge to occur, right? It wasn't so much the algorithms, but a new sensor, right? Okay, so what we see is that we have a paradigm shift, right, in terms of availability of computation and availability of data, right? And the machine learning community has really leveraged that, right? It's also the case of the vision community, right? It's turned into the speech community, right? That disruption has changed. If you didn't shift with it, then you couldn't come out. So that's the threat, you could say. But from the planning community, there is a disruption. We can say, can the planning community leverage off of that? Or as a community which plans and executes plans as well, right? Can we take advantage of that disruption? So I think we really need to think about that. It also could be the case that it's a big out business, right? So there is that part of your question.
No, we know we are not going to go to business. It's not going to happen because we know there are problems where we can't just do data.
Yeah, but that's why I don't view the panel as being, right, if it was Festivus, then we could say, okay, well, we have a threat. I think there's an opportunity, there can be an opportunity here, and it's worth us thinking really hard about that as opposed to saying, oh, that's what machine learning is doing.
Well, just to give a concrete example, if you use POMVPs to do the low-level navigation like people have been doing, your sensors would be like a touch sensor that tells you bumped into a wall. If you want to build an autonomous car, you're not going to feed all the vision and sensor input straight into the, if you want to use a POMVP, you might want your basic observation to be, there is a pedestrian here who is about to cross the street. And the best way to learn that and to recognize that quickly and in real time may be using deep learning. And that becomes your observation. And
sorry to interrupt again, but we already do that.
That's right. No, so
that's great.
Okay, so I'll take my prerogative and then say that. So the point, as I pointed out in the second slide itself, it's not saying ICAPS should just do data-centric or something. It's that this is something that we could discuss, just as we discuss. Anytime somebody talks about expressive planning is important, you can say, why are we talking about this? Why we already have expressiveness? The question is, if there is, whether it's perceived or whether it's actually real. So in some sense, for example, I work in human group planning, where the issue of what is the mental models of the humans, I don't want to write what's in your head. It's kind of hard. So you're supposed to learn these models. And those models may not be learnable in the same sort of modeling languages that we are using. So definitely there are actual theoretical reasons as to why we should be caring about. And secondly, of course, the perception sometimes is indeed reality. So if you go out of the cocoon of planning community and say that, I do planning and I get these PDL models, my rich uncle gives it, they would like to basically wonder where exactly are these rich uncles, coming out of the trees. And so it is true that there are people in NASA and in mission planning, that's where this doctrine versus data thing happens, and there are enough things we can still be doing without having to care about getting models from the data. But we should be a much bigger community, so that, we double ourselves and half of us work in data-centric, maybe half of us work in some other thing, half of us work in some other thing. And so that's hopefully is what, it's not to say that anything is broken, it's just a question of trying to figure out.
So yeah, we just do a meta thing. I'm just trying to build a model and figure out the goal so that I can create a plan to achieve the goal.
I don't understand what you're saying.
So I'm trying to figure out behind the premise, what is the underlying goal we want to achieve.
So you, at the end of this panel, you want to write the next ICAPS paper that will get it. Talk to me later. Okay, yes.
So I heard somebody said something about plans in the wild, right? And I would like some more discussion on that, right? So a lot of the other communities, machine learning, reinforcement learning, deep learning, they have found their goal, right? So they have found the data. It's not that they've said, we're going to wait and we're going to wait for somebody to give us the data exactly in this format and we're going to learn from that, right? So they've actually gone and found nobody curated ImageNet to a specific standard. Nobody curated, MNIST data to a specific standard. They went and found these things. They cleaned up the data. They annotated the data. They did whatever needs to be done, right? So when we're talking about plan data in the wild, and again, it doesn't have to be PDDL plans, right? It can be something else. But I would like some discussion on what we can do as a community to make the data, to in a sense go to the data rather than wait for the data to come to us.
Well, yeah, so I think, ImageNet, that's a very different situation than getting planning data, because ImageNet is largely mechanical, entirely mechanical Turk-based, right? So, and you're just labeling images. So, getting data sets for planning domains is a tricky business. And especially if you want to get a data set really isn't sufficient if you want to do observation gathering, doing experiments on trying to gather more data, which is going to be a critical thing. So there you would need a simulator. So I think it's just a much harder thing, and I agree, we should figure out ways to do it.
Sorry, just in addition to that point about the simulator,
So just a point about the simulator. I mean, even the RL community, for example, when DeepMind wanted to work on the Atari games, right? They found a problem that had a simulator already, right? So they didn't have to custom make an Atari simulator for themselves. They found a problem. Or if it was Go, you can build a simulator for Go easily, right? So I think that's something that we should be thinking about. How easy is it to build those things? And one last point. The reason I brought this up is we talk to a lot of clients every day, right? And sometimes it actually turns out the clients come to us with a bunch of data. It's not PDDL, obviously, right? But they come to us with a bunch of data and they see a planning problem in it where I might not see a planning problem in it, right? So they come to me and say, look, these are sequential decisions. There are causal implications, but links between these decisions. Here's a planning problem. And then I'm left, as Shireen said, we are left to wonder, how do we get a PDDL model out of this to use a planner? The situation should be the reverse, right?
Well, I'd say you should figure out how to use that data to do the planning and maybe not worry about the methods to begin with. But yeah, it would be great. If you have data sets, yeah, we should.
So I think this one way of looking at this also is, even in the image class, in the vision community, I guess some of you are old enough to remember that the sum total of the data set of vision community was Lena, the model from Playboy, right? And then of course ImageNet happened because there were all this. So the question is there a point where we will be getting to a point where we can actually have traces of planned behaviors that we, large scale traces of planned behavior that we are essentially recording, and if so, they can become like public databases. And I think some of them were in that second session upstairs, but I agree with the questioner, Karthik's point that it would be great if that sort of data is made available and then say it's what it is and you do the best you can as make a model and convert it into data. Go ahead. You have it. Oh, sorry, you want to say something?
It seems like it's very specific to different applications. So there could be applications where you do get the data. There could be applications that you have zero data or very little data. So in my experience, it's very application specific. And I guess my third point, if you make some of the tools available, some of the benchmarking tools available, and I guess as you said, Karthik, have some taxonomy of the possible domains, then the new domains comes in and they say, oh, our domain is similar to maybe this is space application, then that may help a little bit.
Yeah, so I was very intrigued by both your question and Rob. I guess it took me a while to get my head around it. So mostly what I do is I do autonomous systems, right, and I do planning and roadwork and autonomous systems, right. So, and the world is kind of replete with opportunities for that right now. So there's tons of places where people want to make autonomous, right. So there is the market for that, right. The model acquisition is a real barrier to it, right, at some level, right. So if I had a corpus of just different systems that we want to make autonomous, having execution runs from it, and then I can take those execution runs and say, how do I automatically learn a model, and then how do I do planning and use my autonomous systems techniques? then I think that's both intriguing, but it would also make the barrier of entry to those technologies much lower. So I do think that that's actually a very fundamental problem. And then the one, so I would say, yes, if you can give me large corpuses of different mechanisms running that I want to make autonomous and give me some qualitative information about it, right, then I think that would be very useful, right? And hopefully you have people focus on top of it, not just focusing on it at all, right? And the other one, which kind of goes back to Raul, so there's one which is execution traces, but just a large corpus of plans, and I actually think that that would be extremely useful because there has not been enough work on how we actually execute those plans, right? If there's a large corpus of them, then we could say, how good are the plans, how executable those plans are, we could benchmark those techniques. But we just don't have a large corpus, right? To do that.
So somebody should be spending time getting that. That's one possibility. I mean, and then, I think it's a success story. PyFail is, has like 40 trillion citations for the ImageNet, which is essentially just getting all the images and getting them annotated. So you can be the next PyFail. That's my point. Okay, please go ahead.
Yes, I would like to mention two things. First, the AlphaGo experience, I think it was quite revealing because it was a very complex problem, right? And it was solved using array techniques and search techniques, right? So it's a combination of the two worlds. So I think that, in order to convince people that planning is important, I think that maybe a very good way would be to challenge them, right? To create the need for them to go and ask us how to solve a problem. So maybe, a good strategy would be to put a challenge to the whole AI or computer science community, right? Like, this is a problem that is important, and let's try to solve it all together, right? And what do you need? Do you need a simulator? We can provide a simulator, or something else. So maybe a concrete problem, like, robotics in general is a challenge, but maybe we need to nail it down like something more concrete. And then maybe they will come to us and ask us, like, how do we do this?
So you want to ask? Okay. Anyone of you say anything?
I actually think that it's a great idea. I have a related point that if you go around the world, everybody thinks planning is important. But not enough of them think that ICAPS is doing the important planning. Okay, and that is the reality. There's no question. I mean, I completely agree with Shlomo. I think that planning is, a great sign of, higher level intelligence, and it's important. AlphaGo agrees that they had to do certain kinds of planning, but we talked about different kinds of models require different kind of planning. I agree with that. But when people talk about those kinds of plannings, does ICAPS community come to their mind? And can we do something about that? And I really like your point that this is the kind of thing, for example, the Vinograd schema challenge people did. If you are into thinking that essentially Ngram models is enough, here is a task, try to solve it with yours. If you can't, then, we are your saviors. If not, of course, then we'll have to find another task. But I think that is an interesting way of engaging rather than just assuming that things will be fine. But, awesome. You don't close the show.
No, definitely not. So, actually, you just sort of mentioned what I was about to say, but I will say it slightly differently. So, we often teach our students AI is about problems and not about solutions. But when we think of a community, very often the key solutions that they have innovated become their identity. So, if you look at the second session, it was somewhat revealing to me myself, because I always had this perception that we are mostly PDDL. There were so many awesome applications. They had learning whenever they needed to. They were all doing some kind of planning. They were often not doing PDDL planning. But sometimes they were doing PDDL plus some kind of planning. Now, but if you think about why couldn't they use PDDL planning? Because PDDL is not sufficient. How would the other people look at us? They would often look at us as PDDL style planners, because there was one room which was full of this PDDL thing, and another room was full of little things. If you have a better taxis paper, where would you send it? Would you definitely send it to ICAPS? Probably not. You could send it to AMAS, you could send it to many places. But if you had a nice heuristics or a causal link relaxation in some kind of a SAS plus representation, where would you send it? You would probably most definitely going to send it to ICAPS or ICAPS track and other conferences. So in my view, I think the perception issue becomes exaggerated, because there is always a theory side and there is always an application side. But a lot of our theory side is heavily concentrated on one kind of modeling language, which has some applications, nobody's questioning those applications, but is not sort of appearing to be the center stage of applications, and many other models are coming up. And so if we could make some concerted effort in either changing the theory side or initiating another theory side, or I don't know how to resolve this, but I think it is important theoretically what we do as much as the session number 2 that we have.
Okay. Any of you want to completely agree with him, disagree with him? Okay, so I guess that's the advantage of running the conference, if people agree with you.
So let me just say. So I completely agree with you on that point. What I would say is that there are a diversity of planning communities, or there's diversity of people who are doing planning, right? And so part of this is to be doing a more effective job of crossing over to those disciplines. And that's always been difficult. We try to do that, right? But I do think that we need to be able to think about planning in its large sense, right? And we need to be able to encourage people to follow the planning no matter what the methodology is. And I think we don't need to just invent it ourselves. I think what we need to do is to take those other kernels and grow from them as well.
Well, make just one comment about the data sets that other communities have created. They don't necessarily, if you look at computer vision, these are not data sets that shows you examples of how to solve a big computer vision problem. It's a very narrow sub-task that they decided is right now for work and so on. So we may need to follow a similar thing. It's not necessarily a data set for testing the entire planning systems, although we actually are in a way more advanced in solving this planning problem. Not in terms of complexity, but the computer vision is maybe more complicated. So they try, for example, in some data sets to say what would be a reasonable labeling and so on and so on. But there are lots of other more complicated computer vision problems that there are data sets here. So it may be a more gradual approach like that would be appropriate.
So anybody else has pressing questions? Yes.
I would just like to share an experience in my industry. So I'm working for an aircraft manufacturer. What I see is that people see learning as an opportunity to prevent them from thinking. I mean, no, really. You know that experts know their model. I mean, if they think, if they do math, you can extract the models from them. But the fact that it's quite boring, it's you have to do math to do that, etc. And so these guys, look at the execution traces of my system, and you will infer the model. And perhaps we can, if we can find a way to show them that if you have a good model, then you have better plans and better performances, then it will be a way not to force them, but to encourage them to extract the models, to do more math instead of just relying on just the experience I wanted to share.
Yeah, let me just follow up and say, I think ultimately we're here because we're talking about visibility, right? There's this data age, and somehow people aren't coming to ICAPS researchers and saying, how can you help us, right? We haven't necessarily shown how we can help, and to Florence question, like we need to say, hey, there's these problems out there, you're solving them the current way, similarly currently, and if you use models, if you learn models and plan them, you'll do much better. This does suggest things like competitions and so on. Other groups would do them, or our groups would do them. We could compete with our ideas and their ideas. I do want to point out there is the RL competition already, and I don't think anyone in planning attempted to learn a model in the RL competition and then plan a not to learn a model. But if we could eclipse those results there, that would be useful. If we couldn't eclipse those results, I think we should learn from that. But I should certainly, I think, to Florence's point, we need to think about where we can show to others, hey, you need what we do. And I think we can, and to that extent, I think we should be on competition.
Other people with other questions? Okay, so I'm going to take, so it's been a great
panel. We first should thank all the panelists. And you know, one of my favorite sayings about these kinds of things is this Columbia School of Journalism seminars guy used to have this very controversial topic that they will discuss, at the end of which he'll come and say, not to make up your mind, but to open it, to make the agony of decision making so intense that you can escape only by thinking. Hopefully you will think for the next 2 days, and maybe we can